Hi everyone. This particular session, I have great privilege and honour to say both good morning and good evening, and to be privileged to be joined by Professor Philip Mendes from Monash University in Australia, from Dr. Jax Wilson, who is independent scholar also in Australia, and Dr. Frank Golding, who is lifetime member of the Care Leavers Australasia. And today we are talking about the paper, which is one of the editor's choice papers in the latest issue of British Journal of Social Work, entitled Child Protection Hypothetical Case Studies for a Virtual Archive, Professional Perspectives versus the Lived Experience and Expertise of Care Leavers in Victoria, Australia. It's so joyous to talk to you, and it's such a pleasure to select your paper for to be one of the editor's choice papers in this issue. How did your work and collaboration come about?
Well, I think in part it all goes back to a parliamentary report from about 17 years ago, which I could even share on the screen if we do that. I'm not sure, Rhea, but I'll get you to let me know. Called The Forgotten Australians, which was a report into institutional care in the 1950s and 60s, and particularly looking at the experiences of adult survivors of institutional care, what had happened to them. And I guess at that point in my academic role, I'd already started researching young people transitioning from out-of-home care, known as former looked after children in England, and looking at their rights, and particularly the failure of most governments in Australia at that time, and really for a decade after, to provide adequate support for them post-18. But at that point, I came across the Forgotten Australians report. I began to communicate with the Care Leavers Australia Network, a very activist, very advocacy organisation, which represented many of the people who had been in institutional care. And through that network and through a conference and some research activity, I guess trying to blend research and advocacy, I met Frank initially and then Jax, who I think had both known each other for quite a long time. And some research activities developed over time, which I might get them to say a little bit about, which then gradually led into this particular project.
Wonderful.
Jax?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, I agree pretty much with what Philip said. Absolutely. I think the Senate inquiry, which was the report on Forgotten Australians, really brought the three of us together in disparate ways, but we got together. Frank and I used to attend various meetings, advocacy meetings about how to get rights for people who'd been in out-of-home care, because one of the things we really wanted to do was to access our records, and accessing our records was such a problem. And when we would get our records, and even today, they come back to us with lots of blacked out lines. It doesn't seem to sort of occur to the stage that these records are about us, and they were never written with us having our eyes on them in mind. So Frank and I were sort of agitating in that space. And then as an academic, which I worked for about 20 years as an academic, I retired early or late last year, and we were all part of an Australian Research Council discovery project that was really looking into the rights of children to access records in out-of-home care, but especially for those adults who've been in out-of-home care. And one of the reasons we liked working with Philip, who is really first and foremost a social worker, is the element of trust. It's very important for care leavers or people who have been made wards of the state that we actually have a degree of trust with social workers. So that's part of the thing, is rebuilding that trust. And of course, Frank and I are of different generations, and we have different experiences of care. Mine was in the 1980s. Frank was very much, I won't say how long ago, but it was a bit of a long time. Grew up in the big, large-scale orphanages. The orphanages had shut by the time I came on the scene in interstate care. Yeah. So that, yeah. Frank, you.
No, I'm quite happy with that summary, except just to add that while we agree that the meeting point was through the 2004 Forgotten Australians report, which was produced by the Senate of Australia, our activism preceded that by quite some years. So it's taken a long time, and that activism actually generated, to a large extent, that inquiry. And subsequently, the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse, which is in the 2012-2013 onwards period. So there's a long-standing involvement in activism, and coming across Philip was a blessing, because he was an academic that understood what we were on about and we could work with.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm also on another Australian Research Council Discovery Project, which was just funded this year, working with another care leaver, Dr. Dee Michelle from University of Adelaide, and Nell Musgrove, who's an associate professor at the Australian Catholic University. And that's looking at the history of activism for care leavers. So how their activism and advocacy has actually led to changes, a sort of grassroots movement, if you like, from below, which is instrumental in getting these big inquiries up and running, and also organisations like the Care Leavers Australasian Network, of which Frank has been a long-standing member and is in fact a life member. So without care leavers, these inquiries all around the world and everything else sort of would fall by the wayside. And I think that's one of the great things about the British Journal of Social Work, is that it's interested in those grassroots movements.
Absolutely. And to really showcase the work which tries to generate knowledge through the work that you've been doing and through the relationships that you have based through this work and through the report coming out. So how did this particular study in its current shape as an ethnography come about?
I guess the context there, Ria, is that I had a child protection background. I worked in the government child protection system, firstly as a very new graduate, a 22-year-old, believe it or not, starting in 1987 for 18 months, and then came back 5 years later for another 3 stint, a little bit older, a little bit more mature, a parent, and so on. I guess one thing I always wondered about, particularly from the earlier period, was what happened to the children and particularly the young people I worked with. And even though we were very much taught in social work in that period, I guess, to sort of be dispassionate, to move on, to leave behind, you know, people that we'd worked with. Sometimes these young people would contact me 5 or 10 years later even, you know, it might have been an incident in their life, a parent dying or something that put them in touch. So I always wondered a bit about what had happened to them. And when Jackson, Frank and I got involved in this research project, we were looking for something that we could create that didn't actually need to involve empirical research with current care leavers, something that wouldn't be an invasion of anybody's privacy. So what I suggested doing was writing what you might call a conglomeration of maybe 30 or 40 people I'd worked with, putting it into 6 case studies, writing up the case notes as they would have been at that time in the late 80s or early 90s, and then writing what a typical child protection professional perspective of that time would have been about what information would have been reasonable to put in the records for these young people, particularly if they were requesting records when they were 18. And then I handed over these case studies to Jackson Frank, and I guess they'll tell you the rest of the story of what they did with them.
Please. Jack, do you want to go first?
Yeah. And then from there, we actually met at a cafe. It's quite an organic process, really, and we talked about what the theoretical basis might be. I did my degree, undergraduate honours degree at La Trobe University, which is big on ethnography. They have the Melbourne School of Ethnography, which was, you know, christened by Clifford Geertz, called it the Melbourne School. So I decided that was the best kind of approach, was a sort of autoethnographic approach. And from there, Frank and I were able to take on, if you like, the narratives that Philip had put down about the social workers writing their case notes. And really what came out of all of that was, you know, really disparate narratives, if you like, or head-butting up against each other, because the caseworker who's writing the notes has a very different idea about that person's narrative to the actual person who the notes are written about. We're not saying anything new here, except of course we are, because these things are often just put under the carpet and not really seen as particularly important. Frank, do you want to?
Yeah, I just go back one step, and that is to say that I've always been interested in the question of why. Why was I institutionalized as a child? Why were all my friends and hundreds of friends whose records I've seen, you know, and the question of why is hardly ever really answered properly in the case notes and the files that were recorded. And I actually wrote a memoir, a quite detailed memoir, many years ago. And when people like Jax read that, they talked about autoethnography, and it's a term that was new to me. But I've been fascinated to study that, to see the way in which the insider story, so to speak, a kind of a counter narrative to the files, can be constructed from memory and from other records and sources. So that's what drove me to this particular activity. And I was very pleased to have Jax and Philip, who've got much more background in the theoretical understanding of how stories are told and created and reality is lived and relived, than I have. And so it's a great opportunity to bounce my practical experience, if you like, off against the academic worldview.
And it feels that even decades on, we are still not getting the partnership work or in relation to how case notes are created and captured and as a record, which can be shared later on, to consider how it will be to read those files and understand the decisions that were made, and embodying those perspectives, which are very much led by professionals and rarely really still reflect the partnership work. And certainly in the UK, that seems to still be the case, that we are yet to learn that. So it really is fascinating to read an autoethnography which tries to, through partnership work, bring those perspectives together. When you were going through the process, what were the key things, considering that you have been dealing with all the issues which are captured with within the case studies for a long time, your own and of other people from different perspectives? And Philip, as you said, so many social workers say, I wonder what happened to people. So that record echoes both for people who were in care and for social workers alike, but that those records remain a contested kind of middle ground in so many ways. What surprised you through the process of doing this research and going through the case studies that were created and through the subsequent work you did together?
Look, I don't know if it surprised me, but certainly it was very clear how different the agendas and responses were. And I guess the focus of the professional worker was on protecting the children, on not causing further trauma, on being worried that if they were exposed to things that were upsetting, that were difficult, that might cause further harm to them. But Frank and Jax were very blunt in saying, well, these are the records of the young people. They're not the records of the worker. The young people, it's the young people's lives, and they have a right to own these records, and equally they have a right to own the decisions about what information should be given to them about their family, about their cultural identity, about why they were removed in the first place, about their experiences in care. That is their life, not the workers. So it should be their right to make that choice about what they hear or don't hear.
I agree that there's not much that surprised me in this. having worked with hundreds of care leavers and their records, a couple of strands I think emerged that are not surprising, but important strands. One is what was written down wasn't necessarily at all reflective of the memory and experiences of the people concerned. So their voice is not heard, and often the experience that was recorded is quite alien. People look at their files and say, I don't remember that. That's not me. That's now not how it was. So that was one strand. And so that was a challenge to say, well, what would you like to say to those records to complete them in the sense? And the second thing was the reluctance to actually allow those records to be revealed. When I first applied for my records, I was told I couldn't have them. And I couldn't understand, why would they record things about me as a child and keep those records for decades and then say when I needed them, well, you can't have them. What was so private about that? Who were they protecting? And so we developed that. One of the things we developed was the rights of people to have access to knowledge and have the gaps filled in their experience. The gaps were so obvious to them and so important for them. So that was one thing that was really important in the process that the three of us were involved in.
Yeah, and I should add too, so in 1980, when part of my file starts, it started a lot earlier than that, of course, but the university trained social workers were then on the scene by the time my files were being put together. And the sort of common themes that Frank was talking about in his file were the same as for me in my file, as they are for now young people in out-of-home care. We ran a very big, what's it called, Frank? We had these down at, was it Australia Square or something? Federation Square in Melbourne, yeah. Victoria. And young people came and spoke about the difficulties that face them accessing their files today. The same problems that Frank was having initially, that I was having, that they're now having, they're not going away. And it doesn't seem to matter which professional group is in charge. There is a reluctance to see these files as belonging to the children and then the adults for whom they're written about. And they're our life story. And for many people, that's the only life story that they have access to. We don't have photographic albums that are given to us. I don't even have any school records. So that's actually quite typical. And it's really important that these files, that we are able to access them regardless of when we were in care, whether it's 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, or 50 years ago.
So that centrality of ownership of the files by children themselves seems to be the key message really to come out of the work for yourselves and to kind of promote among social workers, which still, for better or worse, seems central and something that needs learning and relearning in relation to current practices.
And maybe that's something that social work needs to kind of address. I'm sure social workers, I'm a trained social worker as well, and I've taught social work students, but there's so little time in the curriculum, so little room to really learn about record keeping practices, and not just for children in out-of-home care. I mean, this has a sort of myriad of ways in which these are important.
Absolutely.
There are a couple of aspects of the records that have become quite clear now. And one is that they are very, very negative. Children were problems, or their families were problems. And so a great deal of what is revealed in the files is describing the people as problematic. And there was hardly anything positive to be said. And the other thing that, and I found this very much in my own file, quite derogatory comments, gratuitous comments that don't seem to serve any purpose now that I look at it. But why are so many snide comments made about my parents or about us as children? That would help no one. And yet, you know, that was revealed. Maybe that was one of the reasons why people were reluctant to allow us access, because they were embarrassing comments made by social workers or care workers or case workers.
Yeah, one of the things that we did in the Rights in Records Australian Research Council project is that we actually photographed, Rima, a whole lot of people's files, and some of these assertions that were made about us. I was referred to as a trendy feminist when I was 15 years old, amongst other things. You know,
You still are,
my late 50s. Yeah, that's right. I'm a trendy feminist. You know, so I mean, but these kind of egregious. I mean, that sounds kind of trivial in a way, except it was a bit heartbreaking when I read that, to think that that's how people perceived me, as a, you know, really a young adolescent, and lots of other comments about people wetting the beds. That seemed to be a sort of a favourite one, you know, right through the whole kind of decade. So that came out at the Federation Square big, you know, seminar that we had, which involved a lot of people in out-of-home care now. Very egregious comments about children out of home care. You'd ask the question, why? You know, you're not writing about prisoners, you know. I mean, it's some of our most vulnerable children, and we're still compiling records in this way, which, I mean, you know, obviously workers need far more support than what they're getting.
And what was the life of the study once, beyond the article? Did you find ways to engage and promote it in other ways, whether through social courses or in other ways within the other work that you're involved in?
I think for me, it has inspired some very active involvement with lived experience consultants in a number of ongoing projects with young people leaving state out of home care. And drawing on some of the previous work, both practice work and theoretical work by researchers like Emily Munro at the University of Bedfordshire and Joe Dixon from York University. So we've introduced a number of young adults, some of whom are social work graduates and budding academics, into these projects, and we're hoping over time to develop a national evaluation of what's called extended out-of-home care in Australia, approximating the Staying Put project in England, and hope to employ multiple lived experience consultants in that project to really drive a co-design model, and hopefully a model that's of research that's based on genuine shared partnerships with young people, rather than the terrible paternalistic top-down approach that we've been talking about in past practice in this area.
And because that language of problem, which Frank mentioned, is equally unconstructive and not helpful at all as saying that somebody's not engaging or is at risk, as it still is the language which predominates today in so many case files, which and in practice with how people relate to children in care and care leavers. So if you were to encourage and inspire anyone through this work, do you have any other advice? Because it sounds like some of the work is inspired by work and colleagues in UK and elsewhere. Is there anything that you would promote to, or say to someone who would want to engage in similar work in other countries?
Certainly, that's the case. CLAN, the care leaver organisation that I belong to, is engaged in work with a number of other care leaver organisations around the world, including in the UK and Scotland. In particular, we had a recent couple of online workshops with people from Aberdeen. There are groups in South America who are asking questions. How do we get organised? How do we collect our energies so that we can get inquiries and reports that lead to opening up of things like access to records and the like. But there's still lots of historical work to do. I build myself an historian, and I'm working on a number of books, or two in particular, relevant to this topic that we're talking about. One which deals with the voices, the missing voices of women and children, single mothers and their children. And there are a number of institutions that have not had much publicity and whose records are very, very scanty. But we're trying to dig out the voices of the women and children in those institutions. And the other one is a personal story of my own mother and her family of 5 generations in care, that intergenerational factor, which is so common when people are incarcerated in institutions. They tend to have either their family, their parents were in care, or their children will be in care later on. So there's something there that really needs to be examined very carefully as to how we can break that cycle of institutionalization or taking children into care.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's an inversion of the normal trajectory that people experience as children. Instead of, going to kind of, kindergarten, school, high school, whatever, it's, you get scooped up and put into the system, and it's very hard. We talk about this a lot as academic social workers, whatever, but it's just really difficult to break that cycle. It can be almost impossible. And even when you have, it seems quite, to me, it's quite precarious that at any moment that next generation might end up whisked away and off they go. Yeah. And I've seen some Frank's family tree and stuff, and he's absolutely right. It just keeps finding more and more people along the way that have, been into a big orphanage or something like that. So my own grandmother was in an orphanage because her mother died at childbirth. So these sort of little things you find out down the track, and you think, oh, I wonder if that actually, was the sort of catalyst for a whole range of things happening. These are very interesting questions, but of course there is a person at the end of these questions, a real flesh and blood living person. So yeah.
I think, Ria, if we move into practice as well as research, out-of-home care is clearly trailing behind areas of practice like mental health, like alcohol and drugs, where the use of peer workers with lived experience as significant clinicians in those areas driving better practice and more respectful practice is well entrenched. So we've found in recent research, really internationally, that peer workers in the workforce in out-of-home care are quite rare, whether in Australia or the UK or anywhere, and that would be a real message, I think, to drive that is something that needs to be built on, and we need to catch up those other areas because it's so important for better outcomes for children, young people living in out-of-home care.
And for that work around peer workers to be appropriately supported on longer term.
Yeah, and social work students very much appreciate hearing, these sort of voices of authenticity and, not just personal stories, but, you mix that in with academic, credentials, and also, you're not just telling your own personal story, you bring it across to engage with a whole range of other aspects. You know what I mean?
It's I'm really pleased that
the Times is ticking on. So
I'm really pleased that the article is freely accessible through the journal for anybody who wants to further explore your work. I hope you won't mind, and that it's not too tricky a question to ask what you three are working on now, together or separately.
Philip?
Well, yeah, we're trying to get up this national evaluation of extended care. What we're really keen to show is that the very recent extension of out-of-home care in Australia, influenced by staying put in the UK, influenced by the extended care in about 30 states in America, which we don't often identify as leading the way in social policy, but both the USA and UK have been doing it. So we're hoping that we'll be able to demonstrate both very clear social benefits for the young people, that they'll have better opportunities, particularly for further and higher education, and better opportunities in life in general. And that there are also clear economic benefits for society, that these young people will have, be more likely to enter into the mainstream, to have good jobs, to have good careers. And the community as a whole will benefit from that. So that is the real big agenda at the moment.
And just not to mention it later, and I hope Frank, you won't mind me interrupting. I don't know whether you saw, but I keep thinking as you're talking about, I don't know whether you saw Alma's Not Normal. It's a new series by an artist who is care experienced, and it's available at the moment on the BBC, and it's a wonderful series. And there is a moment where she reads her records for the first time, and I can wholeheartedly recommend it to yourselves and anyone else, because it's another way that everything you're talking about is brought to life. And yeah.
I've seen that being advertised, but I can't get the BBC. That's a different band or something here, so we can't watch it. But I think it sounds fantastic.
It is. It really is.
To watch it. Yeah.
So Jackson and Frank, sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't want to mention that later on. What are you talking about?
I'd just like to say that we're the Care Leavers organisation is this very minute working on a national orphanage museum, and the basic premise is that the best people to exhibit and discuss and display and challenge the history of care leavers are care leavers themselves. So we've managed to get a grant, and we've got a property, and we're establishing that museum. And I think it's the principle of nothing about us without us. That old adage. We need to be in control of the narrative, not let somebody else tell the narrative about us without us. And the other thing that is very big in Australia at the moment is a national redress scheme, addressing those terrible histories of maltreatment of children, particularly sexual abuse, but not only sexual abuse. So that's a very big part of the agenda, and that links to that question of the records. That they're not very easy to use in terms of getting redress for things like sexual abuse, because basically abusers didn't write that story in their dossiers. So that's a very big issue of reconstructing the past in such a way that it's plausible, so that people can in fact be compensated for the terrible maltreatment that they experienced as children.
It's really good to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've already sort of spoken about some of the stuff that I'm doing, which is, the project to do with writing a history of care leaver activism, and just also addressing that deficit model that care leavers so often see themselves portrayed as the sort of bulk shuffling extras in a prison movie or something. There's so much more, there's so many fantastic people around who've been in care and who have achieved, incredible amounts given their histories and lack of support, but also too that they're everyday people like everybody else. So that's a 3-year project. It has a website, and I'll send the link.
Please do. Yeah, that would be great. It's so wonderful to talk to you. The most wonderful part of working on the journal is to meet people such as yourselves and to hear more about your work, and hopefully to promote it for as many people to read it as possible. Frank, your message of nothing about us without us is so important to emphasize, and this work really celebrates co-production and importance of children's voices and young people's voices in the notes, in everything that social workers do. And thank you all so much for finding time to talk to me. And for anybody watching this, thanks ever so much for being here, and I hope you really enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. And please also read the article and promote it and make sure that it's read and acknowledged as widely as possible. Thank you so much for your time again.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.